Sunlight cut through the slats of the blinds, carving long, dusty beams across the living room floor. The air held a stillness that made the faint hiss of steam from a coffee mug sound like a disruption. 6 chairs were pulled into a tight, deliberate circle, their legs pressing into the carpet. Each person sat with a Bible resting on their lap, pages worn thin at the edges. Scott leaned forward, his elbows locked against his knees, his gaze fixed on the open text of Genesis. The others remained motionless, their focus anchored to the center of the circle. No one spoke. The only movement was the slow shift of light as the sun tracked across the wall, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Mark sat at the head of the circle, his hand resting on the table, his fingers tracing the spine of his book. Mark tapped his pen against the table. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and final. He did not look at his notes. He looked at the circle. "We are starting at the very beginning," he said, his voice steady and low. He leaned back, letting the words hang in the air. "But do not mistake this for a simple history lesson. We are laying a foundation that holds the weight of everything that follows." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the group. Scott held his position, his eyes fixed on the open pages of Genesis, his breath shallow. The room seemed to shrink, the focus narrowing down to the center of the table where Mark's hand rested. "This is not a textbook," Mark continued, his tone hardening with intent. "If you treat it like a manual for physics, you will miss the theology. It is a story of redemption, focusing on Israel, leading directly to the necessity of Jesus." The air in the room grew dense. The coffee mugs on the side table were forgotten. No one shifted. No one looked away. The gravity of the statement settled over them like a physical pressure. Mark tapped his pen one more time, a single decisive strike against the wood, signaling that the threshold had been crossed. The study had begun. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as the group processed the scope of the study. Each person remained still, their eyes fixed on the center of the table. Then, a chair scraped against the floor. Sarah shifted her weight, her spine straightening as she leaned back. She looked at the open pages of her Bible, then up at Mark, her brow furrowed, a sharp line appearing between her eyes. She tapped her fingernails against the edge of the table, a restless, rhythmic sound that cut through the quiet. "Are we really going to spend 2 weeks on just the first few verses?" she asked. Her voice was thin, lacking the heavy resonance of Mark's opening. She looked around the circle, searching for agreement, her gaze lingering on Scott before returning to the group leader. The air in the room felt different now. The collective focus had fractured. Sarah reached out and adjusted the position of her mug. Mark watched her, his expression unreadable, his pen held still in his hand. The room waited for his response, the tension hanging like a held breath. Mark did not rush to answer. He set his pen down, the metal clicking against the wood with a finality that silenced the room. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the open pages of Genesis, his gaze steady on Sarah. "Genesis is not a textbook," he said, his voice low and measured. "If you treat it like a manual for physics, you will miss the theology entirely." He gestured toward the center of the circle, his fingers tracing the ink on the page. "It is a story of redemption. It is the beginning of a thread that weaves through the history of Israel, leading directly to the necessity of Jesus." The tension in Sarah's posture softened. She stopped tapping her nails against the table and sat back, her hands resting in her lap. The room grew quiet, the earlier restlessness replaced by a heavy, focused stillness. Mark looked around the circle, meeting each person's eyes. "We are not here to measure the age of the earth," he continued, his tone softening. "We are here to trace the character of the one who wrote it." The focus of the group shifted. Scott leaned in, his elbows pressed against his knees, his eyes locked on the text. Mark tapped the first line of the page, his fingertip resting firmly on the ink. "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," he read aloud. His voice was slower now, deliberate, as if he were parsing the weight of every syllable. He paused, looking around the circle, waiting for the words to settle into the quiet room. Note the word for God here, he said. It is Elohim. He leaned back, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the group. It is plural, a singular subject with a plural ending. A ripple of movement passed through the circle. Scott leaned forward, his elbows pressing deep into his knees, his eyes narrowing as he studied the page. Sarah stopped tracing the margins of her Bible and looked up, her expression shifting from skepticism to intense focus. The air in the room felt charged. The simple text suddenly transformed into a puzzle. It hints at the triune nature of the Creator, Mark continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Long before the rest of the narrative unfolds, the text leaves a mark of mystery. The group fell into a heavy, thoughtful silence. The silence held for a long moment. Then David shifted in the corner. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp against the quiet. He did not look at the page, but stared directly at the center of the table. So, when people argue about the Big Bang or the age of the Earth, they are missing the point? He asked. His voice carried a distinct edge, a challenge that rippled through the circle. Scott turned his head, watching David closely. Sarah frowned, her hand tightening around the edges of her Bible. David leaned back, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on Mark. I mean, the world is billions of years old, David continued, his tone hardening. We have evidence, data, things we can measure. How does this ancient text even begin to reconcile with that? He tapped his fingers against his knee, a rhythmic, impatient sound. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Mark remained still, his hands resting on the open book, but his eyes tracked David's movements. The group waited, caught between the ancient words on the page and the modern questions. The air felt thin, strained by the collision of two different worlds. Mark did not flinch. He let the silence stretch until the rhythmic tapping of David's fingers finally stopped. Then, he smiled. It was not a dismissive gesture, but a slow, deliberate widening of his eyes that seemed to invite the room to breathe again. He leaned forward, palms flat against the table, effectively pinning the open Bible between them. Exactly, Mark said, his voice low and steady. You are looking for scientific proof in a text designed to reveal the character of God. If you treat this book like a manual for physics, you will miss the theology entirely. He tapped the page once, firmly. The point is not the how, but the who. The point is the sovereign command of the Creator. David shifted, his arms uncrossing. The hard, defensive set of his shoulders relaxed, and he leaned back into his chair, his gaze drifting from Mark to the ink on the page. Scott watched the transformation, noting how the air seemed to settle, the sharp edges of the debate smoothing out. Sarah exhaled, a long, visible release of breath, and turned her head to look at David. He was no longer staring at the table with a challenge in his eyes. He was looking at the text. Mark turned the page, the paper rustling softly in the quiet room. He pointed to the second verse, his finger tracing the line of text. Look at this, he said. The earth was formless and void. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The group leaned in, the earlier tension replaced by a collective, heavy curiosity. Scott watched the light from the window shift across the table. Formless, Sarah whispered, her finger tracing the same line on her own page. It sounds like a place that has been undone. Mark nodded slowly. It is a state of chaos, a reality stripped of its purpose. He looked around the circle, his expression grave. Some suggest this is the baseline for our own experience. We see the world as it is broken, fractured, struggling to find its shape. David sat forward, his previous skepticism replaced by a quiet, searching intensity. He looked at the Bible, then back at Mark. So, it is not just a description of the beginning, David said, his voice barely audible. It is a description of the world we inhabit right now. Mark cleared his throat, the sound sharp against the quiet. He tapped the page again, his finger hovering over the space between the first and second verses. There is a theory, he began, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious register. Some scholars suggest a gap here, a period of time where something, perhaps the fall of Satan, shattered the original order. He watched the group, gauging their reactions. Sarah pulled her hand back from the table, her eyes widening. David leaned in, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It is a perspective," Mark continued, "that helps us understand why the world feels so inherently shattered." Scott looked away from the Bible, his gaze drifting toward the corner of the room where the shadows had deepened. "It explains the chaos," Mark said, "not as a lack of design, but as the result of a profound ancient rebellion." The room remained silent. Every person at the table sat still, processing the implication that the world they walked through was a landscape marked by an ancient, invisible war. Mark shifted his weight, the chair legs scraping against the floor. He tapped the page again, this time with more purpose. "If the world is formless, if it is a place of shadows and fractures, then the next verse is the answer," he said. He read the words aloud, his voice clear and measured. "God said, 'Let there be light.'" He paused, looking at each person in the circle. "Do not mistake this for the sun or the stars. They have not been created yet." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the text. "So it is not a physical light?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "It is the first act of order against chaos. It is the sovereign command that forces the void to yield." He closed his Bible, then opened it again to the same spot. "In the ancient myths, creation is a result of cosmic war and divine betrayal. But here, there is no fighting, no struggle, just the word of the Creator, and order emerges from the nothingness." Scott watched the light from the window, realizing the shift in the room. Sarah kept her finger pressed against the page, tracing the ink as if the words themselves held a physical texture. The room felt different now, the early morning stillness replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. She looked up, her gaze shifting from the Bible to the faces of the others. "It is not just about the beginning," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioner. "It is the theme of the entire Bible. Light versus darkness. The constant separation." She paused, her brow furrowing as the thought took root. "It is the wheat from the tares, the divide between what belongs to God and what does not." Mark leaned back, nodding slowly, allowing her words to hang in the air. The connection was clear. The first act of creation was not merely a display of power, but a declaration of moral alignment. David shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He looked at the open pages, then back at Sarah, clearly struck by the gravity of the link. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. David leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the table. He looked at the circle, his expression tightening. "If the first act of God is to separate light from darkness, then we are living in the middle of that ongoing work," he said. He closed his fingers into a loose fist, then opened them slowly. "It is the wheat from the tares. It is the constant, daily choice to align with the light." Mark nodded, his gaze steady. "Exactly. We often think of creation as a finished event, a static point in the past, but the text suggests a continuous process. The separation is not just a historical event. It is the fundamental reality of our existence." Sarah watched them, her hands folded tightly. "It makes the world feel much more fragile," she added. "If everything is constantly being sorted, then nothing is neutral." The room grew silent, the gravity of the observation settling over them. Scott looked down at his own Bible. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He flipped through the pages, his thumb stopping at a marked section. The movement drew the attention of everyone in the circle. Scott watched as Mark laid the notebook flat on the table, its edges worn from years of use. "We need to look at the context of the ancient world," Mark said, his tone shifting from reflective to analytical. "To understand the weight of Genesis, we have to contrast it with the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth." He tapped the notebook with his pen, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Sarah leaned in, her eyes fixed on the handwritten notes. "In those ancient stories," Mark continued, "creation is not an act of grace. It is the result of cosmic war, divine betrayal, and violent struggle between gods." He looked around the circle, gauging their reactions. David frowned, his brow furrowing as he processed the comparison. The scholarly tension in the room grew. Mark gestured toward the open Bibles. The contrast is absolute. There is no fighting here. No chaos that the Creator must conquer through force. In Genesis, God simply speaks, and order emerges from the void. The group sat in silence, the weight of the distinction settling into the air. Sarah traced the words on her page, her finger lingering over the ink. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of the comparison. In those myths, she whispered, everything is born from blood and broken bodies. She looked up at Mark, her eyes searching for a reason for the difference. Mark leaned back, his chair creaking against the floorboards. Exactly. In the Babylonian account, the world is a byproduct of divine butchery. It is a universe built on the ruins of a cosmic war. He tapped the table, his gaze moving from person to person. But look at this text. There is no struggle, no sword, no blood spilled to force the stars into place. David shifted, his hands gripping the edge of the table. So the order we see, David said, his voice low. It is not a victory over an enemy. It is a deliberate, sovereign act. Mark nodded, his expression softening. It is the difference between a tyrant and a king. One conquers through force, the other creates through command. The group sat in silence, the reality of the text settling into their bones. Mark did not rush to the next verse. He let his hand rest on the open page, his fingers tracing the line where the Creator spoke. It is not just that he is powerful, Mark said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It is that he speaks, and the void obeys. The room seemed to shrink. The ambient sounds of the house, the ticking clock, the distant hum of traffic fading into insignificance. Scott leaned forward, his eyes locked on the text, trying to visualize the moment before time began. No effort, Mark continued, his gaze sweeping the circle. No struggle, no exhaustion, just a command, and the architecture of the universe snapped into existence. Sarah sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The air in the room felt dense, charged with the implication of that singular sovereign voice. David looked down at his own Bible, his pen hovering over the paper as if afraid to mark it. The silence grew heavy, pressing against the walls, forcing everyone to confront the scale of what they were reading. It was a quiet power, one that required no violence to manifest. Mark broke the silence, his finger sliding down the page to the second verse. But look at what else is here, he said, his voice steady. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. He looked up, waiting for the words to land. It is not just a distant command. It is a presence. Sarah leaned in, her hand resting on the table as if feeling for a tremor. Hovering, she repeated, testing the weight of the word. Like a bird over its nest? Mark nodded slowly. Exactly. It implies proximity, intimacy. Before the light, before the separation, there was the Spirit, moving over the chaos. Scott looked at the window, where the afternoon sun cast long, shifting shadows across the floor. The room felt different now. It suggests he was already there, David added, his brow furrowed in thought. Before the order, before the structure, he was present in the middle of the void. Mark tapped the table, his eyes bright. He is not a spectator. He is the active, moving force of creation itself. Mark flipped his Bible forward, the pages fluttering rapidly before he settled on a later chapter. We cannot stop at the beginning, he said, his voice gaining momentum. The patterns set here echo through the prophets, the Psalms, and the final revelation. He pointed to a verse in Isaiah, then back to the first chapter of Genesis. Look at the language, the same imagery of the waters, the same call for light, the same separation of the holy from the profane. Sarah leaned over, her finger tracing the lines on his page as she compared the two texts. It is like a blueprint, she whispered, her eyes widening. Everything that happens later is already hidden here. David began flipping through his own Bible, his movements quick and purposeful. "It is not just a sequence," he added. "It is a web." Mark nodded, his expression intense. "Exactly. The architecture of the covenant is laid out in the first few verses. When you see the prophetic echoes, the text stops being a collection of stories and becomes a single, coherent design." The room felt smaller as the connections multiplied. Each person at the table began to see the weight of the implications, the sheer scale of a narrative that spanned millennia. It was no longer just about creation. It was about a promise. The room remained thick with the implications of the design they had just uncovered. While the others continued to murmur about the interconnectedness of the text, Scott slowly pulled his hands back from the table. He leaned into the back of his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His gaze drifted away from his open Bible and toward the far wall, where the afternoon light was beginning to dim. He felt a sudden, sharp dissonance. The order Mark described, the sovereign, effortless command of the Creator, felt light years away from the fragmented reality of his own life. Scott tightened his grip on his own knees, his knuckles turning white. He remembered the project he had abandoned last month, the way he had tried to force a specific outcome only to watch it collapse under its own instability. He looked back at the table, but the words on the page seemed to blur. He was no longer listening to the debate about structure or covenant. He was trapped in the quiet space between the perfection of the text and the messy, unpredictable trajectory of his own choices. A muscle in his jaw pulsed as he sat motionless, the silence around him growing heavy with the friction of his internal resistance. He was not just reading anymore. He was being confronted by a standard he had spent years trying to ignore. The debate continued, but Scott no longer heard the specific words. He watched the steam rise from his coffee mug, thin and fragile against the heavy air of the room. He shifted his weight, the chair legs scraping sharply against the hardwood floor. The sound was small, yet it cut through the room like a blade. Mark paused, his pen hovering midair, and the others turned their heads toward him. Scott looked down at his hands, then up at the circle of faces. He did not look for an answer in the text anymore. He looked for a way to bridge the gap between the order on the page and the chaos in his own history. "I used to think I had it all figured out," Scott said, his voice quiet but steady. The room went still. The academic tension that had fueled their discussion for the last hour vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. He leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the table, and he did not look away. He had spent years building his own structures, believing he was the architect of his own path. Now, the words he had just read made those efforts feel like dust. He felt the weight of every failed plan he had tried to force into existence, and for the first time, he stopped trying to hide the cracks. He held the silence for a moment, letting the weight of his admission settle into the room. He looked at the Bible, then back at the group, his eyes tracing the grain of the wooden table. He spoke of the business venture he had poured 3 years into, the one that had vanished in a single afternoon of bad news. He described the way he had mapped out his future, step by meticulous step, only to have the foundation pulled out from under him. It was not a story of bad luck, he explained, but a story of his own stubborn refusal to see the limits of his reach. He talked about the late nights spent staring at spreadsheets, trying to force the numbers to align with his vision, and the crushing realization that he had been building on sand. His hands moved as he spoke, tracing the air as if trying to reconstruct the shape of those failed ambitions. The room was deathly quiet. Sarah leaned in, her pen forgotten on the table, while Mark watched him with a steady, unblinking focus. Scott did not offer excuses or justifications for his past arrogance. He simply laid out the wreckage, the cold reality of a life that had been dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but the truth he was finally willing to face. Scott drew a long, ragged breath, the sound loud in the hushed room. He looked at the open pages of Genesis, then up at the others, his expression stripped of its former defensive edge. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the text before he pulled his hand back, as if the words themselves held a heat he could not yet touch. "I used to think I had it all figured out," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I keep coming back to this. We are finite." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and stared at the ceiling beams. The admission hung in the air, a final surrender of the ego. He described the suffocating pressure of trying to be the architect of his own destiny, the relentless drive to control every outcome, and the exhaustion that followed when the walls inevitably crumbled. He was talking about the fundamental wall he had hit the wall between his own limited understanding and the vast reality. He looked at Mark, his eyes clear and steady. "We cannot imagine the mind of God, yet he invites us to study his work." The room felt smaller, the air thick. The silence in the room stretched, no longer heavy with tension, but thick with a sudden, shared focus. Sarah shifted her weight, her gaze dropping from Scott to the worn pages of the Bible before her. She traced the ink of the first verse with a trembling finger, as if the words themselves were vibrating with an unseen force. David leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. The realization was not just an intellectual pivot, it was a physical impact. They were not merely students of a text. They were being invited into the inner workings of the Creator. Mark watched them, his pen still, his face softening into a look of quiet recognition. He did not speak, allowing the weight of the invitation to settle into the marrow of the conversation. The sunlight, now slanting lower through the blinds, caught the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the space between them. Scott remained still, his hands resting flat on the table, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The invitation was a present, pressing reality. Mark broke the stillness by glancing at his wrist. The afternoon light had shifted, the beams now stretching thin and pale across the floorboards, signaling the end of their allotted time. He did not rush, but the movement was deliberate. He reached out, his hand resting on the cover of his worn Bible. The group watched him, their own hands still, their focus anchored to his next move. He took a breath, his gaze sweeping across the circle one last time, meeting each of their eyes. He did not offer a final summary or a closing prayer. He simply let the weight of their earlier discussion hang in the air, a bridge between the ancient text and their present reality. Then, he closed the book. The sound was a sharp, final thud that echoed against the quiet walls, a physical punctuation mark that cut through the lingering tension. It was not a gesture of dismissal, but of containment. The lesson was sealed. He leaned back, his fingers still resting on the leather cover, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. The intellectual debate had ended, but the silence that followed felt heavier, more textured. They were no longer just observers. They were participants in a process that had just been firmly set into motion. Mark did not pull his hand away from the Bible. He kept it pressed firmly against the cover, his knuckles pale, as he leaned forward into the center of the circle. The air in the room seemed to tighten. He looked at Scott, then moved his gaze slowly to Sarah, then David, meeting each of them with a steady, unblinking intensity. He was no longer speaking as a teacher to students, but as one person to another. He gestured toward the center of the table, then opened his palm toward the group. "The God who spoke light into existence," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "is the same God who is working in your life right now." He paused, letting the words land. He did not look at the book anymore. He looked at their faces, watching for the flicker of recognition. This is not a distant relic of history. The same power that separated the waters and set the stars in their places is currently moving through your own circumstances. He tapped the table once, a sharp, rhythmic sound that mirrored the finality of the book closing. You are not just reading words on a page. You are tracing the living patterns of the one who holds the beginning and the end. He is here, in this room, and in every moment you face when you walk out that door. The room remained motionless. Scott watched the dust motes, dancing in the fading light, his hands still resting on the open pages of his Bible. He did not look up at Mark. He looked at the text, then at his own trembling fingers, realizing the connection was not theoretical. It was visceral. Sarah exhaled, a long, slow sound that seemed to deflate the tension that had gripped her shoulders for the past hour. She closed her own book, the pages rustling like dry leaves, and leaned back into her chair. David nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that acknowledged the truth of the claim. There was no need for further debate. The air felt thinner, clearer, as if the oxygen in the room had been replaced by something more substantial. They were no longer just analyzing. Scott finally looked up. He saw the same realization mirrored in the eyes of the others. They were witnessing the architecture of their own lives. The stillness held for a heartbeat longer, then snapped. A chair leg dragged harshly against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. Scott blinked, his focus pulling away from the page and back to the physical space of the living room. He reached down, his fingers brushing the edge of his Bible, and slowly slid it across the table. Across from him, Sarah began gathering her pens, her movements unhurried and precise. She stacked her notebook on top of her Bible, the paper edges aligning with a soft, dry sound. David stood up, his chair pushing back with a rhythmic scrape that signaled the end of the session. He did not speak. He simply began to clear his space, folding his notes into a neat square and tucking them into a leather folio. The air, previously thick with the weight of the discussion, now felt charged with the mundane tasks of departure. Mark remained seated for a moment, watching the others. He reached out and closed his own book, the heavy cover meeting the base with a final muted thud. The group moved in a synchronized rhythm, packing bags and stacking mugs. The silence was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with the rustle of paper and the soft click of pens being capped. The group stood in a loose circle, bags slung over shoulders and books tucked under arms. Nobody moved toward the exit immediately. They lingered, feet planted on the hardwood, as if the space around the table held a gravity of its own. Scott looked at Mark, then at Sarah, noticing the way her jaw remained set, her eyes tracing the patterns in the rug rather than the door. The morning had stripped away the usual ease of their conversation. David adjusted his grip on his bag, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the floor. He cleared his throat, but no words followed. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against them like the air before a storm. They began to walk, a slow, rhythmic procession toward the entryway. Each step felt measured. As they moved, the light from the window caught their faces, revealing the shift. The casual lines of their expressions had vanished, replaced by a focused, quiet intensity. They reached the door, but the momentum of the room stopped there. They stood in the threshold, looking out at the street, yet their minds remained anchored to the table behind them. The door swung open, and the cool air of the late afternoon rushed in, meeting the stagnant warmth of the living room. Scott stepped out first, his boots hitting the porch with a hollow, rhythmic sound. Behind him, Sarah and David followed, their movements no longer heavy, but fluid and steady. The sun had dipped below the tree line, casting long, thin shadows across the driveway. The golden light was gone, replaced by the soft, gray haze of twilight. They stopped at the edge of the porch, the transition from the enclosed space to the open street forcing a change in their posture. Mark stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, watching them. He did not call them back. He simply nodded. They moved toward their vehicles, the gravel crunching underfoot. The sound was sharp, final, and grounding. Scott reached his car, his hand hovering over the handle, and he looked back once. The house stood quiet, the windows dark. One by one, car doors clicked shut, engines turned over. They pulled away, moving into the dimming light with a measured, deliberate pace.